So a special welcome to Richard and a very distinguished panel of type experts. I'm not going to introduce them all, or we won't get past the introduction. But Richard, apart from being my excellent predecessor as treasurer of BAPT, is a qualified coach and business psychologist who works with type through his organisation Personality Parts. He's based in Brighton, UK, and is a broad theorist of type from Jung to MBTI to the depth typology of John Beebe, and as a result is aware of some of the ways in which its use can be undermined or marginalized by some of the more reductionist behavioral approaches that can be common in psychology. So hence the current panel discussion. So Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks everyone for coming along. I just wanted to keep this important debate going. So thanks to Roy for his contribution before. I'm going to share this slide quickly, just as a preamble to frame this session, because it's called "How Can Type Thrive Against Prejudice?" So really central to this is the definition of prejudice. What is it? Here's a few different definitions that you might find easily out on the internet. An unfair or unreasonable opinion or feeling, especially when formed without enough thought or knowledge. So we might be debating in what ways is criticism of type sometimes unfair and unreasonable. In what ways is there not enough thought or knowledge? Type is not included in mainstream psychology education, so you do have to go out of your way to even learn about it as a psychologist, for instance. It can also be seen as a preconceived opinion that's not based on reason or actual experience, or just having looked into it in depth, and the preconception aspect, having just made your mind up that there's a problem, and sticking with that is often the problem that I see. An unfavorable opinion or feeling formed beforehand or without knowledge, thought, or reason, but also any preconceived opinion or feeling, either favorable or unfavorable. So we've got to understand that there's positive and negative prejudice, and obviously there's some case for that being out there in sort of type evangelism, perhaps in the type community at times as well. Is the criticism unfair? This is, we've all seen a lot of stuff out there on the internet, some vitriol, as Roy called it earlier. This is 4 ways I think sometimes that criticism can be unfair of type and the MBTI. Straw man arguments, so attacking a misconception, not what a type actually proposes. Attacking the wrong theory. Anachronistic arguments that are out of date, discounting developments that have happened, say, since a version of a questionnaire, for instance, that did have particular problems. Hyperbolic arguments, ones that are exaggerated and sensationalist, taking like what would be a scientific statement, that there's a lack of certain kind of validity or this or that fact, but making it out to them, and that means something is rubbish, useless, meaningless, whatever. Or non-arguments, like criticizing an apple for not being an orange. There's lots of that kind of argument where we're just discounting the valid differences between two different ways of looking at personality. It's the panelists today I've invited because of their knowledge and experience with type. They're greatly respected in the type community, and also hold positions as qualified psychologists or academics, so that they know their stuff, and they sit on both sides of the fence of being professionals in psychology, but also being experts in type as well. We're going to ask these 3 questions and just try and give each person some time to just make their point and their position clear on each of these. The first one being, is there prejudice against type? So I'm just going to go around, and see what people's initial positions are on this. Roy Childs, perhaps if I can start with you, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's no doubt that there is a lens which does not look wider. And the academic psychology area, which looks at, when they talk about what is a valid questionnaire, is such a narrow and outdated concept of validity, and yet it's not being questioned. So at the very heart of that is the thing that all of those personality things say it must predict behavior. And I'm saying, if your model is behavioral flexibility, is how much you're able to change behavior. That's what we're looking at. I mean, and I wanted to ask John Paxson about, the models of validity that we need to develop to counter it, because yeah, the prejudice is through one tunnel lens. And I just find it very frustrating that people say things. Even my professor of psychometrics at Exeter said things which were just so, they haven't even bothered to understand the idea of a dynamic type model.
Yes, very good points. Thank you. And yeah, anyone else want to go next? Steve Myers, perhaps? Would you like to unmute?
Okay, thanks, Richard. I mean, I think from my point of view, I think I want to deconstruct the question a bit, because it does carry some implicit assumptions that we could examine. And in fact, it's useful to deconstruct it from within typological theory itself, because typology is, in one sense, a theory of prejudice. I mean, looking at the definitions that you put up, not based on reason, non-arguments, and straw man, actually that is built into type, because what type does is tell us give us the worldview. We see certain things and we don't see others. It does actually trump reason in a sense. And it's a bit like, in mainstream psychology, you've got Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, or Jonathan Haidt's Rider and the Elephant, and it's the elephant that kicks in and is the thing that we see as prejudice. And in fact, when Jung wrote Psychological Types, he didn't just apply his theory to typological functions, but he applied it to, other kinds of worldview and attitude. So politics, religion, and culture. And in fact, I've just picked out a couple of quotes, if I may, in chapter 2. I'll put them on the slide. In chapter 2, he said, now he's quoting Schiller here, but obviously agreeing with it. He said, there's a very remarkable psychological antagonism among people in an age of progressive culture. No work can have a decisive success with one class of people without incurring the condemnation of the other. It frustrates every attempt at a settlement, because no party can be brought to admit either a deficiency on his own side or a reality on the others. And I think the next bit is very important. He says, yet there is always profit in following up such an important antagonism to its final source. And I think actually, I'm looking at it from a theoretical point of view, but I think Roy has shown how you can actually look at the antagonism and try and integrate them in a very practical way. When Jung quotes Schiller, Schiller is saying this can help simplify the problem, but Jung gives a much more important reason, because he says that no one can possibly know or imagine how he appears to his opposite unless he allows the other to tell him to his face. And I think the integration of that feedback into our self-awareness is a crucial part of the process of individuation. And it isn't just us as individuals who need to individuate. The community that uses type needs to individuate as a whole. Even the theory itself needs to individuate. And and I do read that as being the sort of thing that Roy was calling for in calling for the way I saw it, an individuation of the theory. And I think that if we take that approach, I think that will lead us to finding new ways of bridging the antagonisms between typology and mainstream psychology. So I'm looking at it from the point of view of the two sides and seeing there being positives and negatives on both sides, and saying, we can't just be prejudiced for type and try and defend, because that will actually make things worse. I think we do need to look at the positive things that the mainstream psychology brings, and also recognize some of the problems that Roy pointed to in our own theories as well.
Thank you, Steve. It's a good point. How can type evolve if we don't accept the weaknesses that it has, or any issues? Ian, Jenna, would you like to contribute?
Thank you, Richard. So unlike perhaps some of the other speakers, I would describe myself as a pracademic. in the sense that work at the business school at MMU. Quite interesting that I've introduced type with our postgraduate students on the MBA and the sports directorship. But that started with quite a large arm wrestle with someone who was an apprentice from Furnham and School of Andy Grant, etc., and how on earth can we possibly have world-class leading programs with such nonsense? And I was blessed and most fortunate because there was an opportunity to have all of the program and unit leads together, and literally the two of us had a bit of a sparring competition. But actually what won the day was the unit leads experience, because each of them, I'd worked with them on type preference. And so coming from a felt experience, and I think that, you know, that sort of user validity. So yes, I think personally, my experience has been that academics are very narrow in their focus. That's how they get measured for their articles and their writing. And they need to keep editors sweet. And if they don't keep editors sweet, then they don't get ref and they don't get, you know, on their promotion track. So it's quite interesting. And I think my experience has been that academics, as clever as they are also pretty narrow and fairly, strong word, lazy. They don't actually look at the detail and they jump very quickly to a position. I'll pause there because there are others that might want to say something on that.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, so Angelina Bennett, is there prejudice against type?
Well, yeah, we see the criticisms come up all the time on LinkedIn articles, etc. And I think looking at your definition, Richard, it does definitely come from a prejudgment based on very little knowledge. And I think if people understood it better, they would think twice. And it often astounds me, like the ferocity of people's like hatred of it when they actually don't know what they're talking about. If I hated something that much, I think I'd probably find out why. So yeah, definitely prejudice coming from lack of knowledge. I completely see the place for both camps. I use trait as well. And I often say to people that type sort of sits below trait. It'll sort of tell you where your natural filters, energies, default settings, whatever you want to call it. I personally don't use the word preference anymore. But it'll tell you what you're, as you said, what you're filtering in, filtering out, attending to, or discounting. And on top of that come your traits and behaviors. So there's completely place for both. It doesn't have to be an either or. But personally, I do encounter it when, you know, someone will say, I've got a client that wants to do a team event, but they don't want to use MBTI because it's old, because they've done it before. And again, picking up on Roy's point, that idea that I got to best fit and that was it, I've done type, often comes up. So yeah, I think it's the lack of actual knowledge. And when you do use it with people and they get it and they benefit from it, they become really good advocates. And that seems to be something spreading through younger populations at the moment. Yeah, so that's what I'll say at the moment.
Thank you. That's some good points. Yeah, and we can follow some of those up again in this third section today. Like, what can we do about it as well? Leslie, Francis, would you like to contribute? What is there prejudice against type?
There's only one answer to that question, of course, and the answer is yes. If I could introduce my kind of perspective responding to Ian's introduction, I'm one of those narrow-focused and I guess lazy academics. I work within the field of personality and individual differences as a research psychologist. And for me, the culprit, the blame, goes into that school, the school of personality and individual differences. And it's broader than just a problem with psychological type theory, but I think it's rooted in a lack of serious philosophical reflection within the school as to what those words personality and individual differences means. The problem, I think, is to do with the word and, linking personality and individual differences, because the field is hungry to gobble up as many individual differences as it can within the name of personality. Now, not everything that trades as being concerned with personality is actually dealing with the same stuff. Psychological type theory and the Big Five model, for example, are not dealing with the same things. I'd recommend to the field of personality and individual differences that it does some clarification between what for me are three very different constructs. There's a construct to do with character. That's something over which individuals have some control, agency, responsibility. There's a category I would call pathology, over which individuals have less agency, less control. And there's a category I want to call personality that is neither character nor pathology. Now, if we look at models of personality used in the personality and individual differences tradition, the most recent, the Hexarco, is a model of personality that confuses what I want to call personality with pathology. If I look at the Big Five, it confuses what I want to call personality with character. The point about psychological type theory is it is to do with neither personality, neither character nor pathology. And a lot of the stuff that's built into other personality models is not concerned with. There are two routes from which personality models can be built. One is the hungry mathematical reduction of as many individual differences as possible. And the other begins from a theoretical stance of knowing what it is one's wishing to look at. The benefit for me of psychological type theory is that it works from definition, energy sources, and those two core processes. It's not concerned with a lot of the other stuff that personality is used within the phrase personality and individual differences is concerned with. To get over the problem of prejudice, I think we have to be clear about what we're talking about and where it does not and where it does overlap with that bigger field. End of presentation.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, you raised some good points about the philosophical underpinnings, which are obviously very important in terms of reflecting on, the basis for which type and trait approaches come from. I hope we can expand on that in the final section as well. So the second one is question 2, really. Let's assume we've asked so far, is there prejudice against type? And for the sake of actually being able to continue this session, let's assume that we've decided there is. And therefore, we can ask, well, what does its impact? If there is prejudice against type, what is its impact? And I want to involve everybody who's here today listening as well. You can use the chat, and this can be professionally for you or personally for you. What is the impact of prejudice against type, whether that be things that come out on social media or wherever you might have experienced it from, whether it's in your life, wherever that might be. So yeah, please just give us some idea of what's the impact of prejudice. What have you witnessed? And I'd like to go back around the panel and ask them the same question. What is the impact of prejudice against type? Roy Childs, would you like to start us off?
To me, it's been this rigidity. And it's a bit the old one that we said people don't get fired for choosing IBM in the old days. The business schools in particular want Neo because it's got the badge. They want Hogan because, ridiculous though it is, the way they have presented what they do ticks boxes. And as I said earlier, they're using the wrong models. So although I'm allowed to train in the Neo, we stopped training in the Hogan. I know these instruments. The way it impacts is that there is a closed mind to thinking about people developing. And that's the biggest issue, because the psychometric model is about fixedness, no change. I mean, we're almost saying we're measuring DNA through people's verbal report. And I know Dario might have something to say about that. Of course, there's a correlation between what we say, but it's that narrowness of thinking and not thinking as a result of it. Well, Neo, why Neo? you know, and you can't challenge it because they need the safety of knowing that they won't be criticized by the academics.
Thank you, Roy. Yeah, very good. Steve, would you like to add to that?
Can I answer your question just by giving a couple of very quick stories? And one relates to young generally, and the other relates to actually my team role questionnaire that's part of Roy's type mapping system. The one that relates to young generally, and it's a very emotional impact, was I moved house about 10 years ago, and I thought I'd go to I'm a member of the political psychology section in the BPS, and I thought I'd go to not to that section but to a local psychology meeting that was in a pub. And I got there a bit early because I wasn't sure where I was going, and met an organizer, had a nice chat. And I should say that most people I meet in mainstream psychology are quite open to young and to typology. It's only the exception. Anyway, we had a chat. And then about 5 minutes later, another organizer walked in and introduced, and I said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing a PhD in Young." And his facial expression changed, and pardon my language now, but I think it's worth saying. He said, "Young was a shit." And he repeated it, "Young was a shit." And he turned around to the colleague and said, "I just told him Young was a shit," and walked off. And that was actually how I felt immediately after that. And I, you know, I've had other people rejecting type in the past, but you know, I never really felt so bad, and it damaged. I didn't go back to that organized meeting again because you know, I couldn't actually face that hostility. But as I say, other psychologists. The other story is when I was in South Africa, I say running a course on the management team roles indicator, which is part of Roy's type mapping system. And it was a 2-day course, and there was somebody there who was very senior in the South African equivalent of the British Psychological Society. And I said at one point, I said, "What you've got to remember is all personality questionnaires can be wrong." Well, he hit the roof, and you know, he said, "You know, they've got validity and reliability behind them." And it wasn't until it was quite disruptive to the workshop, I would say. I mean, he kept coming back to it over the course of the 2 days. And then I think for him, the penny dropped on the second afternoon when he suddenly said, "I get it now. So what you're talking about is finding the start of a conversation." And I went, "Yes." But I think that the impact was that was quite disruptive as well to the whole exercise of learning. And it you know, it was a big obstacle to overcome in terms of the learning about you know, about the type mapping system.
Thank you, Steve. Some really interesting stories there, yeah, about personal, in-person, face-to-face experience of you know, just that kind of like negativity and aggression almost towards type or Jung. I mean, I find, you know, personally, you know, it's a funny thing to have a thing in your pocket, a device like a phone where little bleeps can come and up pops comments, you know, deriding one of the things that you see as a speciality in your work, and it's almost like, you know, the amount you have to get into the trenches to go and try and battle this stuff, but it seems like an endless barrage, and it's personally, you know, it's quite tiring, or it's depressing and frustrating to have that kind of constant thing that, you know, on your own it feels like it's too much of a kind of tide of negativity and misunderstanding to try and correct. Next, I think we're going to go to Ian. What are your experiences about the impact of prejudice against?
Okay, so to build on the lazy comments, and for me, very much the academic community, and this debate is reminiscent of quants and quals. Academics are either quantitative or qualitative, and neither two shall meet, and that's quite an interesting one. But I think that the sadness for me is that when I hear people being so rock certain about something, I sort of think, crikey, how on earth can you live in a world where you are so sure? And just asking them to just check out the basis under which they come up with those criticisms. And that's quite sad. in terms of if we're starting to look at impact. But for those very people that have then had such a negative impact, when they and I did manage to get my way to keep using type with the MBA students and the MSD students, when they come along and they're required to join in as part of the program team to work with the students, we use it as an opportunity of getting to know one another. It's fascinating how the students just get that. And so what happens is that they begin to suspend judgment, which has been quite interesting. Those people that are so rock certain about just how inappropriate the MBTI is or type is. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Some more great points there. Angelina, would you like to add to that next?
Yeah, I was well. Obviously, personally, it impacts my ability to work with clients because, as I think Renee put in the chat there, they're always looking for the next new thing. And as Catherine has said in her chat message, people are really certain that, oh, type, yeah, that's been debunked years ago, isn't it? That got seen as a fake, didn't it? And they're absolutely sure of this, not knowing where that may have come from. And I think that's part of the impact here that it has on me is really being able to work with it with people actually and get them to understand how helpful it can be. I mean, I'm so glad I found type in my life, and my first job was with OPP because I quite imagine what sort of nightmare of person I would be if I hadn't learned about it. So yeah, personally it impacts me that way. But there was something else I was going to say and I've forgotten it already. It was based on one of the comments. Oh, it was from Sharon's comments, commenting here about curiosity. I gave up, Richard, replying to these people years ago because it was a waste of time, because they're already formed their opinion. They're not asking about it in curious ways or saying, can anyone tell me why type still exists because I thought it was crap. There's no curiosity. So I stopped responding years ago. And it would be nice if actually they were open to actually having a discussion about it.
That's a good point though, yeah. I mean, if one of the impacts is that it makes people give up in even presenting the opposite opinion, in some ways that kind of strengthens the whole narrative that this is what everybody thinks, this is the truth, and it's so difficult to then come back against it later. And in a sense, we've had decades of that, which I see as part of the problem. This kind of a cumulative effect of the lack of a strong, balanced debate or opinion on the other side. Leslie Francis, would you like to answer this question?
Thank you. What I've encountered, I suppose, as a lazy academic, is the peer review process in which work is tested and the range of journals that are appropriate for publishing in within the broad field of psychology of personality and individual differences. At that point, I'd want to make a distinction between psychological type theory and the Myers-Briggs type indicator. There are other operationalizations of psychological type theory that have different kinds of psychometric properties that may have greater transparency in both reliability and validity. And of course, I'd promote my own, the Francis Psychological Type Scales, as something that I've tried to get properly validated through publication in the peer review literature. And over about 20 years now, have gradually built up a profile in that field. I wish there were others doing the same thing, and doing the same thing particularly with the better known Myers-Briggs type indicator. I think it's by fighting in that forum that the theory and its predictive capacity can be seen to be something that cannot be rejected because it is transparently clear that it can follow the general rules that the academic community sets up and wants to assess stuff by. But it's when I get back in the peer review process, an editor saying, I'm not sending this out to peer review. It's about psychological type theory. It's not worth putting it out for peer review. Makes me cross. Thank you.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? If, how can someone even peer review something that they haven't studied in the first place, and if type isn't really part of mainstream psychology education, how can you expect it to be? Perhaps a lot of, and then there's perhaps the circular issue that if perhaps lack of good quality evidence in academia strengthens the argument to rubbish something which prejudices people against allowing the research to happen in the first place, how will we ever get the evidence to get us to do the research? It's all an endless circle, I see. And I think it just needs to start with curiosity, again, that word, within academia, to be able to study things for their own sake and be open to the outcomes, and allow research to speak for itself. So the third question, and we do have a decent amount of time for this. So if we've seen there's prejudice against type, and we've got some idea of the impact, what can be done about it? That's question 3. What can we do differently? Is there anything in our power, as a group of people, knowledgeable people within the type community, as people also, in the profession of psychology, some of us in academia, some in practice, what can be done? So I'm going to ask Roy first, have you got an answer to that? What can be done about it?
I've just put it in the chat, actually, Richard, that I think that until we actually articulate why MBTI or any of these are not meaningless, because they're called meaningless because they've got no validity, because they don't predict behavior, which is not the model that suits what we're talking about, which is a dynamic, one at the prediction end, the measurement end, 2 at the criterion end, what we're measuring. And as I say, the idea as I see it, that we are freeing people to become more flexible in what they do. Self-awareness leads to choice, which leads to then being able to respond appropriately if I want to, which almost is the opposite. So you wouldn't predict the behavior, you would predict it from the maturity of the person as they engage. So we're talking about completely different models of validity. And I don't think we've articulated that. I know that, I was listening to John Haxton, talking about experiential validity, which there's something in that. There is something in that that's important, but it's not enough. So we need something much more clearly articulated around what we mean, which is saying you can't say it's not valid because that's the wrong model that you're applying.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good point. Trying to articulate clearly what type should actually propose, what kind of outcomes we would expect, and then hopefully, allowing that, if it's allowed within academia, for that research to actually happen and to become evidence. But I know you, Roy, you do talk, as I do sometimes, at more like general like psychology conferences. To believe that, is that a forum to start this process? If you want to make these changes, where are we going to do it?
I do think that because as we know the impact of, if the noise in the academic world is that all of this is meaningless, that has disproportionate weight. So I think, yes, in terms of the leverage, is getting academic respectability, which means that they can't say that as glibly as they do now. So yes, I think there is an academic piece to be done here that could help change the balance.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to carry on later discussions about what that might be, because I'm interested in kind of reconvening a sort of BAPT research council or something like that, to try and ask what are the questions we need to be researching, to really make a difference here. So it'd be great to have your voice involved in that. Steve Myers, what can be done about the prejudice?
I'll give an answer to that in a second. Can I just make a quick comment about the lazy academics? Because I think it is a relevant point that Ian raised. I'm a visiting fellow, and actually that means I'm the only academic who really can be lazy, because all the academics in the department where that I'm visiting are so burdened down with all the teaching responsibilities and the supervisory responsibilities and all the sorts of things that academics have to do as part of an institution, that they all complain that they don't have the time to do research. And you know, I mean, they're given sabbaticals, but they're only you know, very relatively small amounts of time. For when they're not on sabbatical, they're really snowed under. So I think it's not the lazy academics. I think it's the academic context that I think is the problem, that actually acts as a bit of a straitjacket and means that they can't look outside perhaps the fields in which they're working and teaching. In terms of ideas, I actually want to go back to the comments that Leslie made in his first set of comments, and also that chimed with a lot of what Roy said in the presentation. I do think there's a need to look at the philosophical basis of our theories and also at the clarification of concepts. And I note it seems in the chat that I think Roy and John may have agreed to meet, and I think that's that's one practical way. Perhaps they can pick that up and start talking about that. I do think we need to, as I said in my bit, I think we need to take on board some of the criticisms and actually recognize the truth in them and actually do something about it. So, for instance, we need to do some longitudinal studies with type, about doing type, choosing a career, and then seeing what happens 10, 15, 20 years later in terms of the outcome of that career, and see whether, in fact, your career has fitted your personality and has resulted in a better enjoyment of your personality, or whether actually the career you choose changes your personality so that you fit in. I think there is a need for that type of validity as well as the other types. I think also that, I mean, Roy mentioned that there's lots of detailed things as well, where I would say there are some criticisms that we need to take on board. And the question of reliability to me seems to be one of cross purposes all the time, because the MBTI scales are actually comparable with any other questionnaire. When you look at the scales, the problem is as soon as you introduce a cutoff point in the middle, because you can have people, and you have most people near the cutoff point, and it only needs a small error in the questionnaire or a small variation, and suddenly somebody's gone from one type to another type. And I think that there's a big issue there about these cutoff points. And as you may be aware, Young disagreed with the idea of there being a cutoff point, because he said, look, the types are the extremes, and then there's the normal group of people in the middle who are more or less balanced, driven by both sides. So I think there is a lot of I go back to that phrase, there is a lot of individuation that typology as a theory has to go through, I think, before it can really start to overcome the antagonisms. I don't think we should battle the criticisms, like Angelina's comment about not taking them on. I don't think we should defend. We think we should take them on board and look at developing our own theories and attitudes, and saying, let's take on board the valid criticisms and see if we can develop type so it is more suited to transcending the two sides of the debate.
Thank you, Steve. That's really good points. Yeah, the evolution of type. And I'm curious, about to what degree, type, well, certainly the MBTI itself as an instrument hasn't evolved, because of its legacy and having to respect its roots and the creators and where it came from. And actually, most of the other instruments we see out there tend to be clones almost of the MBTI, or clones with a kind of different theoretical kind of structure. There's this instruments that are basically trait instruments cloaked as type instruments with that kind of cut-off problem.
Can I just make a quick follow-up comment about that? Because in the Jungian field, it's now called Jungian and post-Jungian studies, because the theory from Jung, there are lots of things about Jung's theories that are very problematic. I won't go through them. So when somebody says to me, again, pardon my language, Jung is a shit, there are actually aspects of his personality and his attitudes where that is true. And you know, there are certain things that have been changed in the theory as a result of that. What we don't have is an equivalent in typology. So there ought to be a Isabel Briggs-Myers and post Isabel Briggs-Myers development of the theory. But you're right, we've got stuck. It's become a religion because it's, you know, it's the Saint Isabel has laid this theory out, and we use it the same way forever and a day. And as you know, Jung was critical of that interpretation of so there's actually three parties here to integrate. There's the Jungian view, the Myers-Briggs typology view, and the mainstream psychology view.
Interesting, the post-Briggsian world. Let's see what we can where we can take that. Ian, Jenna, what can be done about?
Let me continue to pick up on the theme of lazy, because I think we've got a responsibility as practitioners not to become lazy, and that we have a responsibility to work with our clients, introduce people to type, and to help them see that there's a contribution to be made. You know, that, you know, not everything needs to be addressed with a hammer, if you like, the sort of adage of the hammer and the nail, if we just keep on looking for these things. And I think for me, it's wanting us to remain curious about those criticisms and not to be so rock certain about that, and to work with that. I definitely have found and continue to encourage individuals think, what does type have to say about that? What does trade-based instruments have to say about that, in order for people to discern for themselves how they're living their best life? And I loved your part, Roy, in terms of the ideal self and who they are, and how it is that individuals discover. And I think that the type has a contribution to make, and increasingly I've found, dare I say, even amongst, you know, some of the academics, they're not prepared to come out because it could impact on their next journal. You know, there are, you know, groupies, if you like. There's the Adam Grant groupies, and it takes a very brave soul. And whilst I do accept the point you're making, Steve, about workload models and academics being bowed down, there is that trajectory that they need to get those ref points. They need to get into those 3- and 4-star journals, and they're going to do that the best way they can. And I think for me, lazy and grabbing sound bites, and, you know, what are the quick wins for them, and I think that that's a contribution to be done. So my challenge is for us not to become lazy and to remain curious.
Thanks, Ian. You kind of alluded there to the sort of toxicity of the narrative that kind of, you know, puts people off wanting to be associated with the debate on the other side, and it kind of creates this almost this illusion of the crazy 1%. But actually, when you have kind of personal, private conversations with a lot of psychologists, there's a lot more of them that are open-minded and curious about type than it would just be made out to be by the critics, actually, which is interesting. But there's a toxicity that makes this public, you know, face. People hide out from associating with things. Angelina Bennett, what can be done about it?
So I've written a few things down to keep forgetting what I'm going to say. But picking up on your last point about the toxicity, it does sort of strike me that whenever there's a big criticism of it, it seems to get way more publicity than any good stories. So maybe there's something we need to do about trying to publish positive and practical examples of these things and get them more well known than the critics. But thinking about the academic side of it that you were talking about, I'm a visiting lecturer at Westminster Business School as well, and I tend to use it with the students that I'm working with, do a type session, get them introduced to it at a young age. And I've actually got a research student who's using type in his research at the moment. So that's all good stuff, positive stuff. And I think in a way it is about maybe using type and bringing type to populations who actually really could benefit from it at the moment. So, you know, the applications for parenting that some people work with, I mean, I found them invaluable with my ESTP child, who some of you may have seen running around naked behind me yesterday. So parenting, education, the work that Jane Kesey does with schools, I think these are the places where it can really add huge value and be very impactful. Whereas businesses, quite frankly, if they want to say we've done type and we're bored with it, you know, I don't know if I could be bothered to convince them, but it's got really good applications and use in other places. So that's probably what I think we should do with it, is find places to introduce type that are useful. And one of the things me and Gareth were working on recently was some stuff for introducing type. It was really going against that sort of 16 personalities that's extremely popular. Everyone takes it, gets the type, reads it, goes, oh, that sounds like me, or not. And that's where they leave it. So it was trying to bring those people who are interested in that to start to apply it, thinking of their careers and stuff. But I also see some of the stuff we produced as helping younger people say, actually, I'm okay. I'm, you know, when you see this type description of yourself and you think, oh, that's a valid way to be. I don't have to pretend to be something else. And these are the things that I bring to the world. So trying to counteract some of the horrible negative modern life stuff that young people are faced with.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. And so just go out and demonstrate the value of it when used well and properly. And that in itself might help convince people. Yeah, so we did actually get some interesting quotes just before I go to Leslie. If someone said, you know, all we need to do is get McKinsey to use it and be open about it, everyone will flock to it. It's a good point. You know, if there were prominent, you know, people who turn around and say, well, actually, you know, you do need to look again at this, and actually there are, you know, there's people who are prominent now starting to do that, like Nikita Mikhailov, who you might be aware of, and you know, who I know through SciPub and LinkedIn. You know, people who are known people out there who are starting to say, actually, yes, you do need to understand and look at this again, because there's more to it than the critics are making out. But yes, having more role models who can champion and change the narrative would be useful. Leslie Francis, what can be done about it?
I've been asking myself that question only for about 30 years. As an academic working in psychology, I've had a kind of covert strategy for the last 30 years in attempting to use measurement in psychological type theory in ways that will be acceptable more broadly in the academic literature. And I suppose that there are 5 things, as I think about it, I've tried to set out to do. And each of these things is involved working as much as possible with other like-minded people. I wish there were more like-minded people with whom I could work. The first has been based in, yes, the philosophy of science. And my main conversation partner in that field is Professor John Lloyd, whose work critiquing various models of personality has, I think, been quite helpful and useful. The second thing, working with a colleague called Chris Ross from Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, has been putting in a presence at the American Psychological Association's conference most years since 1996, and quite often convening a small symposium within Division 36 on type theory. It's built up a bit of interest. The third thing has been to publish quite a lot, probably now up to about 100 articles with data on type. And that does build up ideas about reliability, validity, and predictive power. Fourthly, in particular, I focused in the health psychology world, professional burnout, and I think demonstrated the way in which measurement in type theory can predict both increased levels of burnout and removing from certain professional spheres. Religious ministry and teaching are the two that I've worked in. And probably the fifth thing I've been trying to do is to build up a school of doctoral students. And I suppose, again, over the last 30 years, I may have had 15 or so doctoral students through my school who've used type theory and convinced external examiners that it's a respectable job that they've done. So amidst all the laziness of the academy, I think a bit of connected and concerted work can, over a long period of time, potentially lay the ground for changing things. I said at the beginning, I wish there were more colleagues with whom I'd been able and could be able in the future to collaborate.
Well, it's a fantastic amount of work you've been doing, Leslie, so, respect to what you've been achieving so far. And like you said, it's difficult when you feel like there's not others to if there was more type-based research symposia at conferences and people were more willing to just come out and work with and explore this stuff and not be bothered by the toxicity that might otherwise dissuade them. So we've got a few minutes left. I believe we're finishing in 7 minutes time, unless Jerry says otherwise. We could have more of a kind of back and forth. I don't know if there's any particular points for the panelists that other panelists brought up that you were either wanting to add to or debate about, or add a different spin on something. Is anything that's kind of brought up any extra thoughts for you?
I just made a point in the chat, Richard, how when I've sort of watched through the Myers-Briggs Users Group and BAPT, the direction that people go in is to deeper and deeper and complexity, which loses people. And then at the other end, you've got the quick fix, simplistic thing. And so it's the middle path, which I think means having layers of what we're doing. So Leslie's deeper sort of philosophical basis, but also how we convert, WXYZ from going into the drawer to going into life, and so how you get people to take those steps. Because so many people have done MBTI, and as you say, they've forgotten even what their letters are. I thought that was useful at the time. So it's giving them, 1, 2, 3 that they take away, and that has impact. So I don't know. I mean, I've got ideas on that, but I'm sure other people have as well.
I think Jung's original portrayal of type, which was he said you could get into greater and greater complexity, and he said, I'm not going to go there. So he said there can be 16 types, there can be, and he's mentioned a few other numbers as well. But what the great thing was, he used the analogy of there being a compass, which I think does hit that middle sort of ground between simplicity and not necessarily complexity, but profoundness. Because when you're using a compass, there are certain landmarks that you're close to, but your individual location is unique. And I think that's what he meant, by the compass, is it can help you to navigate through the various different situations. And it is, it is a very simple model with just, 4 points of the compass, the 4 functions, and you can start from that point. But we aren't starting from that point. We're starting from the point of putting people into 16 boxes, and already that's more than than the mind can hold, I think, for the average person, and why they don't develop it. So I think there are ways that we could explore that idea of as you say, finding the middle ground, really, to make it profound but simple, a heuristic. And Jung said type was a heuristic. That's the ground we need to find.
Will Schutz's book, Profound Simplicity. That's what we've got to find.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
I would say to Steve, I think what Royce brought up before as well about separating the disposition from the behaviour. Since it's a behavioural heuristic in a sense. That what you actually end up doing is only influenced by type preferences, like by the dynamics of psychological processes underneath it, and it's being aware of the situational effects and the intentional, like volitional effects that all combine with that and create the outcome. So anybody else want to add to this point? Any of the other panelists?
I think the comment I'd make is keep it as a working hypothesis, and just invite people that are introduced to it to kick the tires on that and how that might be applied. So I echo the point Roy's making. For me, when I started to get my head around type dynamics, I think that brought a different level, if you like, of understanding from the sort of rather sort of fixated, usually the four preference pairs and the whole host of debate that continues from there.
That's another debate in itself. You know, so I mean, my position is that the 8-function model was Jung's original model essentially, and the actual underlying basis of what type is about. And yet there's no real evidence to support that yet. So it's very difficult to bring forward a theory to kind of replace what we've got already. And anyone else? Last time for last comment, Angela or Angelina, sorry, or Leslie? No? I think we're nearly done then. Well, thanks for everyone for coming along. I think we've had some interesting points today. One of the things that strikes me is, that we've got a lot of people in the type community who are experts, but in some ways we agree on some things. We've all got our slightly different positions. We're all trying to do our best to try and create a meaningful narrative to help persuade people and critics that type has got value and should be looked at. And I think part of our challenge is to persuade each other first and have some kind of coherent narrative. That's what I'd love to see emerge, and have more of these kind of discussions. More, I've open to many more long email debates, Steve Myers, with yourself, to really try and pick apart some of these issues, and actually to between us as a community form a really strong position and together have a proposition that can be taken forward and tested. Because I think when we're divided and everyone's got their own slightly different opinions of what type is or is about, I think it's very difficult to kind of compete with what is a pretty basic and simplistic negative narrative that we're facing in the Prejudice. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Jerry if he wants to wrap up. I appreciate everyone for their comments. Some really interesting, rich debates going on in the chat as well. Sorry we didn't have time to really address all and mention the comments, but thanks very much. Sure, Jerry's still here.
Jerry, you're muted. Oh.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. Yeah, so thanks again to Richard and all the panelists, not only for such a rich discussion, and there's so many lovely positive comments about that in the chat that I hope you're all seeing, but also the fact that you managed to keep to time with 6 of you. So that's a huge achievement. So brilliant work. There's half-hour break before the next session. I guess a natural step for some from this session, especially if you're using type professionally, could be to log into Sharon Lavoie's session on making and keeping type part of the conversation in the business context. And the alternative at 3:30 is Mina Berriman's fascinating session on eye movement therapy and type. So that should be really great. A quick advert before we go. Zoom is great, of course, but don't forget our face-to-face event in London in June. Details are now on the website. And finally, I'm putting in the chat just now a link to our latest beautiful and thoughtful type animation, which you can watch if you haven't done so already. Please take a few minutes to watch it, comment, and share with your network. So look forward to seeing you through the rest of the conversation. I'm going to stop through the rest of the conference, I should say. I'm going to stop recording at this point.